everyone, my name is Annie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Arthurian literature, which is the literature surrounding the legend of King Arthur. The first class I ever took regarding the medieval period was in Arthurian literature, and I had no idea how much I would love that, and because of that class, really, I started studying medieval literature and came to where I am now. But before I took that class, I was already interested in the Arthurian myth, but I didn't quite know what texts to read when beginning to read about King Arthur, because there's so much Arthurian literature, not only in the medieval period, but up to today, there are so many reiterations of the story being told. I think there's a fascination with the legend of King Arthur that really began in the medieval period and is lasting till today. So I thought I'd recommend a few medieval Arthurian literature texts that are good for people who don't really know much about the Arthurian legend, but want to start reading that literature and want to start immersing themselves in that. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the legend of King Arthur became really popular in England after Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his History of the Kings of Britain in 1136. So as the title may indicate, this was a comprehensive history of all the kings that had ruled Britain up until 1136, starting in Roman times and up to the time that Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing. And he claimed he was translating it from an older text, which gave this text a lot of authority, and people read it really as a history. But Geoffrey of Monmouth included King Arthur as a real king of England in his histories. And when people read this, they thought that King Arthur really had existed and was a king that had ruled England during this Anglo-Saxon period. And this text, I believe, is one of the main proponents of the misconception that King Arthur really existed and really was a king. And I think this is a good text to begin familiarizing yourself with the actual legend, so with the origin story of Arthur regarding Uther, Igraine, and Merlin, and how he was conceived, and how he became one of the greatest rulers of England. And if you want to look at just the chapters that talk about King Arthur, those are books 8 through 12, and book 7 of the History of the Kings of Britain has the Merlin prophecies. This is a more historical text, as the title indicates, but I think it's a great starter if you want to familiarize yourself with what people were writing about King Arthur when the legend truly became popular. So the second origin story of King Arthur that I would like to recommend is Robert de Boron's Merlin. And Merlin is one of the 3 romances assigned to Robert de Boron, which include Joseph of Arimathea and Perceval, and it tells the whole story of the Grail. And yeah, but I'm gonna focus mostly on the Merlin today. And this text moves from more of a history, as we see in Geoffrey of Monmouth, to a more romance type of story. This is the first Arthurian text that I read, so it holds a special place in my heart, and I understand it may not be for everyone, but I really enjoy Robert de Boron's Merlin. I think a lot of the motifs that we see in later texts of Arthurian literature can be traced down to this. And this is an early 13th century text, so a bit after Geoffrey of Monmouth. So the Merlin volume of Robert de Boron's Trilogy starts with a council of demons talking about how they're gonna get their revenge on Christ. And their solution to that is to impregnate a woman with the devil's son. And this woman is Merlin's mother. So Merlin has that origin story of being born of a devil. But because his mother was a Christian and she named him after her father, Merlin does not become the Antichrist that the demons want him to be. He becomes this prophet and sorcerer that we know him as. So I think it's really interesting to read his origin story because he's such an important figure to the Arthurian legend. And it also portrays him in this light that he's not completely good because he's born of so much evil, but he also does so much good for King Arthur. And this story goes past the origins of Merlin. It talks about the usurper king Vortigern, which Merlin helps defeat through his prophecies. And then we get to Uther Pendragon, the father of, I almost said Anakin, the father of Arthur. And again, we see a similar origin story to that seen in Geoffrey of Monmouth of Uther, Merlin, and Igraine. While it's similar to Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling of the story, we also see the sword and the stone for the first time in this, and as we all know, it is a very famous part of the Arthurian legend. And we also see Morgan Le Fay for the first time as Arthur's sister. So I think this is a very important text in Arthurian legend because so much of what we think of when we think about the Arthurian legend comes from this text. It is quite dense, so it may not be for everyone, but I think it's really important for the medieval Arthurian legend, and yeah, I had to include it. So now we come to the spin-offs, which are not directly related to the main Arthurian story that the other texts deal with, and are more about the knights in Arthur's court. And this is where literature really expands a lot. There are so many stories about a knight in King Arthur's court. The Wife of Bath's tale, for example, has a knight in King Arthur's court. And in the medieval romance, King Arthur's court kind of becomes an expanded universe, if you will, where single adventures can take place. So the first spin-off that I would like to recommend has to be Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances. I'm sorry if I butchered that name in French. These were written in the 12th century, and I think they're one of the most influential pieces of medieval literature ever written. And as you can tell by the name, it is in French, but there are really good translations, including this Penguin one. There are 5 romances in here, but in particular, I would like to recommend the Lancelot tale, the Knight of the Cart, and Yvain, the Knight of the Lion. So as you can tell, King Arthur isn't the focus of these romances, but that's what happens when we get into the more spin-offy kind of stuff. So Lancelot tells the story of Queen Guinevere being kidnapped by an evil knight, and Lancelot going after her because he is her true love, and it shows the hardships that he goes through, and it's one of the most cited examples of a courtly romance and of courtly love. So I think it's a very influential work, and it's really fun to read. I really enjoy reading Lancelot. I've read it several times. And Yvain is also a really fun adventure. Although it doesn't have the iconic love story that is Lancelot and Guinevere, Yvain is just one thing happens after the other. You can't really, there's so many things happening in the story, but it's a really fun read, and I would highly recommend these 2 romances. I think they're really influential, and I think it will really help you understand what other texts in the Arthurian universe that aren't directly related to Arthur are about. Now, of course, no list about medieval Arthurian literature would be complete without Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. And as you can see, this is the text that I've worked the most with. It's the one I'm writing on right now. I absolutely love this text, but don't worry, as you can see, it's very big. I will not be recommending this entire text. I don't think that if you're just getting into Arthurian literature, you should just open the Le Morte d'Arthur and read it. I think that's a suicide mission. So I would be recommended one story inside Le Morte d'Arthur. For those who don't know, Le Morte d'Arthur is kind of a compilation of all the Arthurian legends that had been written before, put into one. And this was written in the later half of the 15th century. Malory went and read all those romances and all the French sources and English sources that had been written about King Arthur and made his own version and added a lot of original things and changed a lot of the original sources. But this is kind of the main volume of Arthurian literature for the medieval period because it kind of compiles all those stories that had been told before. I will be recommending one story, and that is Sir Gareth of Orkney, and it is book 7 of Le Morte d'Arthur. I think Sir Gareth is a really fun story to read. It's a very fun adventure of a boy who comes into King Arthur's court, and he has really high relations, but he doesn't tell anyone, and he starts working in the kitchens of the court, and then when the opportunity arises, he asks to go on an adventure, and he goes, and things unfold from there, and he proves himself to be a very, very good knight. And it's just one adventure after the other, which is the case of a lot of these Arthurian romances, and I think it's really fun as a spin-off story, and it's a good introduction to Malory because it's shorter than a lot of the other books, and it's just really entertaining, and you follow one character mostly, so it's not as confusing as the other books when you follow several different characters and there are way too many names. I think Sir Gareth is a good way to start reading Malory. So yeah, these are my 4 recommendations for someone who is just starting to get into Arthurian literature, or if you've seen a show, if you've seen a movie that talks about King Arthur and you're like, where did this begin? Where is the root of the Arthurian legend in the medieval period? And I think those 4 texts are really fun to start with and will really give you a bigger understanding of where the legend comes from and the different reiterations that have been written throughout the medieval period. And I will be leaving links to the texts that I can find online and to the editions that I recommend, so you can give them a read if you'd like. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to have you here. I hope you all go out and read these wonderful Arthurian texts, and again, thanks so much for watching.